Welcome to this first episode of Ocean InSight, a new podcast series on marine conservation and ocean science for sustainable development, with a unique perspective from those on the front lines of research, policy and action, brought to you by the MeerWissen initiative. Paul Tudor and myself, Hauke Kegler, are your hosts of the show. So join us on a trip to Africa's ocean and coasts as we discuss some of the ocean issues that affect coastal communities in the African partner countries, but might also have unexpected consequences for our daily lives in Germany. Today will be all about the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and how it affects coastal and rural communities in the Western Indian Ocean. With us today is Dr. David Obura, the founding director of CORDIO East Africa. His NGO focuses on generating knowledge and finding solutions that benefit both the marine ecosystem and the people depending on it. He also just recently co-authored a report on COVID-19 and the future of ocean sustainability. So let's dive right into the interview. Hi, David. Good to have you on the show. Let's start off with a little bit of a personal background. What's your connection to the sea? Did you grow up where you're living right now? Did you travel a lot and get to know all the different coasts in the world? You seem to be knowing everything about the ocean, so there must be some sort of secret link that we're not aware
of. There's some secret connection. No, thanks, Hauke. Great to be on the show. No, it's interesting actually. Growing up, I grew up in Nairobi, which is an inland city in Kenya's capital, 500 kilometers from the coast. But we always came to the coast on our school holidays. And in fact, we always came to a family cottage. So 3 times a year for probably 10 or 12 years, I was on the coast, on the south coast of Kenya. And I'd love the reefs and the beach, of course, and going out at low tide and exploring. So on the whole, I was really into the environment and nature and animals, going camping and hiking. But the sea was always there on the side, and somehow it took over in importance as I went abroad for studies and learned to scuba dive and experienced some winters, and then realized that a warm coral reef was really the place to be for my career.
Excellent. Yeah, we seem to share that love. Although growing up in northern Germany, it's not that beautiful coral reefs you expect, but I really enjoyed spending time, especially in fall and spring, with the storms at the northern German coasts.
Yeah, well, actually, when I was studying on the Pacific Northwest in Canada and the US, that's where I got to experience big ocean and storms and waves, and yeah, I think that really impressed on me. Of course, the mountains and the coastline was beautiful, and that's why I went there initially. But I got drawn to the sea because of how impressive it was there.
Maybe just out of curiosity, I mean, you could have probably ended up somewhere, globally. So maybe Canada or US. Why Kenya? I mean, why did you decide to come back to Kenya to do your work there?
Yes. So I came to North America for the end of high school. The last 2 years, I did my undergraduate there. I was at Harvard University, and then my PhD at the University of Miami. But I always wanted to move back home. I never wanted to stay away. And in choosing my graduate studies, of course, I considered some high tech. Everybody's going into genetics and microbiology and things like that, and even medical school. But I realized in the end that I wanted to live back home or in a similar country, and I wanted to work on issues that are important in a country like Kenya, not issues that are important within the US or Europe, for example. So I designed my PhD so I would do the fieldwork at home in Kenya. And I managed to get a project and some funding to do that. And that was so I could do a dry run, make sure that I was studying something that I could work in, moving back to Kenya. So and it worked out. And after I finished, I spent a year abroad, but then I came back and I've been here since then.
It's quite interesting because I mean, for the listeners, early in my career when I was struggling to choose what to study, I think David was quite instrumental in offering mentorship to me. And I remember one of the lectures that he gave us as a class was that if you want to be rich, that this is not the right career path for you. So perhaps when choosing your career, I mean, you mentioned that this was more like a passion for you and not necessarily the economic benefit that comes out of it. And perhaps there could be young students who are struggling with this challenge of should I go for a high paying or should I go for something that I'm more passionate about? What would be your response to this for particularly young scientists who are listening to you today?
Yeah, well, that's an important question, Paul. But everybody they have their own priorities. I mean, of course, being in marine science like this, it's not a high-paid career for sure. But when I look at the quality of life, comparing myself and all my peers, for example, who I went to school with in Nairobi in high school beforehand, and those who have been very successful in companies or private sector and other things, I mean, I have no question that my quality of life is high compared to theirs because of the work that I do. But I've also been very fortunate. When you look at scientific careers, of course, some do pay higher than others in terms of high tech fields or microbiology and things like that, or medicine. But yeah, you have to go with what makes you happy, and also lets you live in the kind of environment you want to live in as an adult, or with a family, or have children, and so on. I think it's very personal choices for all of us.
Thank you very much, David, for that. Maybe if we delve on the current issue, the COVID issue, how has the COVID-19 affected CORDIO East Africa in terms of funding and also in terms of research, be it positively or negatively?
Well, for CORDIO, we've been very fortunate during this COVID pandemic because for we've been in operation for 20 years now, and 3 years ago, now, so it's 2 years at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, we actually had a large institutional grant from NORAD that really gave us a lot greater financial stability than we are used to. Normally, we get 2 or 3 year large grants and then smaller, shorter ones. But now this gave us really a 5 year work plan that we could count on, and a budget from a good donor that we knew if we justified what we needed to do, we could have a real dialogue with them. So we've been able to, as an organization, we've been able to ride through the pandemic relatively easily. Of course, it affects a lot the kind of field work that we can do, both in terms of reef ecology fieldwork, where we can travel to and where we can't, what we can do and what our partners can or can't do. And of course, working with fishing communities has been very much impacted because going to the field and interacting with people, coming from a large city, and Mombasa was a bit of an epicenter of the COVID pandemic at the beginning in Kenya's first wave. Very conscious that we had to stay indoors and that we should also not be carrying risk to the communities that we're working with. So it really did put a hold on a lot of activities. For a while, our staff had to work from home. It changed our dynamics, not being able to see each other all the time and have online meetings. So it's been a struggle to deal with that. But we're very conscious that it's been more difficult for the communities that we work with and the government agencies and so on that we also partner with to try and work out how to get through this crisis and come out the other side with projects intact and funding streams, to continue the work and so on. So it's still in progress. We're still struggling with it.
Looking on a more global north to south cooperation issue, could that also be a way of transforming science a bit in the future, going a bit away from scientists from the west or north coming to countries in the tropical south, doing their research and then leaving again? Maybe it also opens an opportunity to have a more equal share of conducting science and producing the results in the end. Well, what's your experience in that after like 1.5 years of not being able to travel?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I don't have a straight answer for that. I mean, with scientists from the north or partners coming here, not being able to do that for a few years, of course, it has impacted on certain projects, and they just haven't happened. As a small organization, we don't have the capacity to suddenly, a partner would have come out here and done some work, so we can take that over. Give us some money and we'll do it. We don't actually have the staff to be able to take on more work suddenly like that. And of course, there are students from universities here who are out of work or who more freelance, but we don't have the mechanisms in place to know who they are and to be able to suddenly take on more people and take on contract work. So I think that's certainly an interesting dynamic that you point out, but it takes time to set that up. And of course, the question is then over the next 5 years, as we come out of this pandemic, will institutions in the global north and the global south have the space and the funding and the foresight to set up those mechanisms as a coping strategy for the next time something like this happens? Because of course it will in one way or another. So I think the answer to your question is a lot more about the building back better or building forward better, and how do we do that, as opposed to if we could have done it during the last year. Because I don't think we could have, but of course with mechanisms in place, perhaps it would be possible in the future.
What about communities? I mean, you mentioned that, of course, the research or movement was restricted in one way or another because of the COVID pandemic. Now, how are the communities being affected? I mean, we know, for example, the coastal communities that heavily rely on tourism were severely affected because, I mean, tourists were unable to travel to the Kenyan coast. In terms of local communities' resilient to be able to cope with such pandemic, what has been your observation? I mean, particularly living along the coast and doing your research with the coastal communities.
Yeah, so I mean, the experience of the COVID pandemic has been really hard on communities and low income sectors in the cities in Mombasa and Malindi and other places like that, because a lot of the money flowing in the local economy does come through tourism and does come through the spending power that tourism brings, not just the tourists going out and spending, but also all the workers and employees living in local areas. And of course, they spend in the markets, they eat fish, buy fish, and so on. And of course, 80%, I mean, I heard that 80% of small businesses closed down because, there were no tourists. Of course, the hotels had almost no visitors for almost a year. Um, so, and then of course, movement was very restricted. So communities, tend to be more isolated. They tend to get less, I guess, robust news. There are very severe lockdowns, and the police presence on the roads is very strong. And in Kenya, that's very intimidating to people without much education or resources of their own, or knowledge about what their rights are and access to lawyers. So avoiding traveling. So even if fishermen went out fishing, maybe they couldn't get their fish to markets, or the fish sellers wouldn't come to the beach to buy fish. So it had a huge impact and was very hard. I think in rural areas, of course, people are luckier than in urban areas because they can at least, there is food growing in the local area. Even if they're not growing it themselves, there is some local produce, and there's shade, and there's cleaner water and things like that. But in urban areas and informal settlements, and it's been very hard for a lot of people. So I think really seeing the impact of the lockdowns on people's lives and livelihoods, it's very important to try and understand that, so that when we do need to have public health measures such as lockdowns, how can it be done in a way that doesn't impact on the livelihoods and local economy of people who don't have very much to begin with, don't have assets or savings they can use for a few months to get them through a crisis.
Regarding that, could you observe or tell us and the audience a bit more about the coping mechanisms? Because I think, it might not be as obvious to everybody listening to this show what the options are for local communities to diversify their strategies and maybe to build up resilience also for future crises to come. As I guess that's very different from what we are experiencing here in northern Germany at the moment.
Well, I think coping mechanisms. So during the last year, I think during the pandemic, coping mechanisms have involved a lot of social networks. For one, in terms of people, businesses, I think foundations, religious groups. We were able to do it as well through our Norwegian grant, because we weren't able to use funds in certain ways for our research. The donor actually encouraged us to look at how we could provide some community support to some of the communities we were working with. So we were able to do that, and you could see in the Mombasa community there were many businesses and individuals, bringing contributions together of money and people donating their time to pack, food supplies and things like that for giving to families in low income settings. So there's a lot of social networks are very important for that. And of course, if there's the more resources behind those, the more they can support people. So I think in moving forward, really understanding what kind of networks can provide support like that will be very useful. And then, of course, within communities, what are the livelihood streams that they have? So it might be some direct income from tourism, might be some direct income from fishing, protein from fishing. But how do you make sure that you know the the streams are not too narrow? They're multiple different livelihood streams, so that if one is cut off because you can't sell anything to tourists, there will be others that will at least provide some basic income and food and so on in moving forward. So those diverse strategies, I think, at local levels are very important, and working how to build those up effectively. It's a challenge to do it. We can't just come in and say, hey, we'll support an alternative livelihood and get everybody chicken farming so they can sell poultry. It's complicated. It doesn't necessarily work in different settings, and that local context and sustainability really needs to be looked at closely.
Thank you very much, David, for that. One of the things that I've seen a few publications regarding the impact of COVID on conservation is that in some countries there has been increase in the level of illegal activities. And in one of the recent reports by the IUC, and that is a special issue on marine protected areas in the times of COVID, I've seen one interesting result is that in Kenya, for example, they cite that there has been an increase actually in the number of nesting, sea turtle nestings at the Kenyan coast. So I found this quite interesting because one would expect that with the COVID, illegalities will increase in the Kenyan coast, but actually there is the reverse. What will be your response to this?
Yeah, so I should look. I haven't read that article myself to see where the numbers come from. So it could be that it's just a spurious correlation. It just happens to be that way. It could be that people are doing more sea turtle patrols because there's either a social process supporting that, or maybe even if there's some income or exchange involved in it that increases the motivation. I think illegalities in the marine protected areas. I think overall fishing was suppressed because people couldn't sell their fish, and of course you might go out and fish for your own use in the family if you can't sell it. Um, but yes, I think there's a lot of really complex dynamics going on, but I would say that the concern more generally is that the lack of support for conservation. So we are involved in a COVID support mechanism now that WWF instigated, and there's GEF funding for it. And this is really so terrestrially and in marine systems in Southern Africa, East and Southern Africa, is because there's been less money for tourism going to community conservation areas in particular. Does the commitment to conservation decrease because there's no income coming from supporting, wildlife being on the land? And so there's a real effort to try and make sure that for a couple of years there's some funding going to nature-based tourism projects to sustain those businesses. So as tourism picks up, they will still be there and in place and able to continue supporting conservation and sustainability the way they were. So I'd say there's no easy and short answers to that. It's a real challenge understanding what happens in different places and the importance of doing. I'm not saying we have to do a lot of science in all of these places, but having a really good understanding of the factors in play locally to understand, and the communities and their identity and what factors affecting them, the businesses around them, to really understand what's happening in each context.
Yeah, I think most governments are now frantically working on recovery strategies for the time after the pandemic. Going forward, do you think, with the fear that there's often an emphasis on economic recovery over sustainability issues, also for the marine realm, how do you think could we combine this two? So working on biodiversity conservation, sustainable resource use, and recovery from a crisis like this.
Yeah, so that's an important question also, because I mean, COVID-19 crisis is really one symptom of the global changes that we're undergoing, and I really advocate to emphasize the Sustainable Development Goals as a good model for talking about this, because it's a huge mistake to look at each crisis in isolation. So COVID-19 is a health crisis, but emerges from changes in so habitat fragmentation and use of species and biodiversity, and eroding nature in various places, and all this happens because of unsustainable consumption and production practices. So the economy. So we can't just look at COVID-19 as a health crisis that we need to deal with in isolation, because it emerges through biodiversity and climate crises and economic crises. So I think it'll be critical for COVID-19 recovery to really focus on the big picture and make sure that actions across the Sustainable Development Goals or across the Sustainable Development Agenda are being supported properly, in order to avoid not only the next health crisis, but also food and water crises, to avoid conflict, to avoid climate impacts and natural hazards. Because it's only through dealing with all of these together will we be able to minimize, their aggregate impacts, and also to actually stop the crises from happening. Because the moment, if we only deal with the health component of COVID-19, the next COVID or similar health, the zoonotic, the emergence of diseases from natural sources that are being disturbed, there will be many more. So we need to really prevent the emergence of these crises, not just work on the impacts of the crisis.
Actually, on the SDG agenda, we now have, I mean, I was just talking to a friend of mine recently on issues of conservation in general and some of the global targets that are currently, being pushed forward. So you have the SDGs, you have the Ocean Decade, and perhaps to viewers or listeners who might be confused about all this, how can we use these global targets to drive or transform, local priorities? Because there's always that mismatch between what we are driving, at the global scale and what's really happening at the local scale. So how do we, bridge that divide between the regional, global, and then at the local level?
Maybe just to make clear, the SDGs are the Sustainable Development Goals. So maybe not everybody is familiar with all the abbreviations we're using here. Just for you to know out there. Sorry.
Yes, no, thanks, thanks, Haka, for that clarification. Yes, because I mean, I deal with the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, all the time now, and it just rolls out a lot more easily as an acronym. But I think so. These global targets are there because countries in the United Nations have agreed on all of these global targets, or are formulating them. And the only reason they are formulating these targets or making these conventions is because they affect citizens, and citizens are affected in their personal life, right? So they do completely relate to local experience and individuals, people's experiences, but the language is very inaccessible, and they appear to be just at those higher levels. So I mean, I've been really pushing the idea of identifying, a personal narrative or local narrative around the Sustainable Development Goals. You can make a story around sustainable development in your context. I work in coral reefs, so I've done it for a coral reef fishing family. And it makes sense at the local level, and it makes sense at the international United Nations level. The key thing is not to use jargon, and to identify where these things come together. And I think the key thing there is that the Sustainable Development Goals, I mean, there's 17 of them, and there's one on climate. There's two goals on biodiversity. There's a goal on hunger. There's one on income. There's one on jobs and economy. So really, they encapsulate the universe, or all the things that we need to deal with between nature, economy, and society, that need to balance across those three things. Now, the individual targets and conventions like climate is a really important one. There's a convention on biological diversity, dealing with nature. The FAO, and there are various conventions dealing with food. There are others dealing with disaster risk reduction. So there are individual sector conventions, and they set up their targets and goals. And I think it's important that we see them being knitted together through the Sustainable Development Goals. And then through the SDGs and those goals, you can relate what needs to happen at the national level down to local levels, because it's only through succeeding locally that countries will deliver on any of their sustainable development goals and their big commitments. So I think really working through these narratives or storylines of sustainability at multiple levels is one way to make that happen, and to make it clear that these global conventions and global goals are important and they are tangible to each individual if you identify that, how that happens at the local level. And the other thing that's important there, I think, is that, because you have very different people in so I'm in a coastal town in Kenya, or a coastal area. So we have fishermen, we also have hotel owners, we have business people in the city, we have some landowners and people, communities. They all have different interests, right? But they all depend on the same space. And that space, to give each person the maximum value, that space needs to be healthy, needs to be functioning. So they have a common interest through the health of their local environment. So I think the Sustainable Development Goals can let a hotel owner, a fisherman, a business person, a government officer, each identify their interests in the local system being healthy, and in pursuing what they do, they make sure that they don't harm somebody else's interests. And I think, if we bring this to the COVID pandemic, I think it's in terms of thinking forward about what actions should be done for recovery in a local context like this. How do you build a recovery mechanisms in place that enhance or strengthen the interests of each of these stakeholders in the local area? And I think the Sustainable Development Goals give us a framework to discuss that. Of course, not everybody's going to agree, but if you agree that we need sustainable development, then most actors hopefully will agree that, yes, I will do this action because it's good for me and it's not bad for you. And I won't do that action because it's good for me, but it's going to be bad for other people. So I won't do that. And I think that's how these these global goals can help in this process.
David, maybe just as a follow-up, if we focus, let's say, on SDG 14, let's say one that focuses on marine protected areas, how are we doing in the Western Indian Ocean region in terms of progress, or in terms of attaining some of the targets that are enshrined within the SDG?
The challenge with things like the Sustainable Development Goals or any global goal is that they, of course, have to be quite simplistic. And under SDG 14, this is a goal on oceans. One of the targets is to protect 10% of marine areas. And this was adopted from the nature targets and the Convention on Biological Diversity. It turns out that in the West Indian Ocean, if you look at the region as a whole, I think we protect more than 10% of our exclusive economic zones are under a form of protection. So we pat ourselves on the back and say we've done very well. But the issue is, if you break it down, so the large, the majority of that is in EZs around two islands that France owns. And so there's nobody living on the islands. There's nobody going in and using that marine space. And it can easily be designated as a protected area. So there's no challenges there. But when you come, for example, to the continental coast and to the ecosystems that are supporting people and livelihoods and supporting a lot of diversity, say coral reefs or mangroves, the percentage of those ecosystems that are protected will be very low. And it might be around 2 or 3%, maybe, or 5% even. But then you also have to look at how effectively are those locations being protected. And that will vary from location to location and amongst countries. And a big issue that's emerging now, which, because the CBD, the convention, is identifying new goals for biodiversity for 2030 and then on to 2050, is that in Africa, with the population growth and economic levels that we have, we really need to we have to go far beyond thinking about biodiversity protection just for nature itself, which of course we need to have that to sustain it. But we need to have healthy natural systems to provide benefits to people. so fish and coastal protection and things like that. And so it's not just about the 10% that might be well protected in a protected area, but if the other 90% is not being managed well, which is where people have access to the resources and should be benefiting from it, they may not be because it's completely degraded, and they might in fact be suffering from that. So, our performance in terms of the targets for SDG 14, we really need to look under the hood and see that we're managing the whole system well, in which 10 or 30% might be extremely well protected, so it's really healthy and regenerating. A lot of those benefits that regenerate there may get used elsewhere if the fish move outside, or carbon sequestration inside a protected forest is good for people outside, far away from the protected forest as well. So we really need to look at how the natural functions and these benefits extend over the whole land and seascape, where there's a whole range of different conditions, from intact and very healthy parcels of nature to quite heavily used and transformed parts, but still in a healthy state and functioning and providing benefits to people. And I think in the next decade, for the next round of biodiversity targets to 2030, and those will be very relevant to the Sustainable Development Goals and SDG 14, is how well are we dealing with the whole system and making sure it's functioning and able to regenerate and providing benefits to the people that need those benefits too. So there's a huge equity discussion as well around who benefits from nature being protected, and we have to make sure that the right people are benefiting.
Yeah, thanks, David. Maybe now to put you in spotlight and in charge, if you were given like 1 year of coastal and marine governance in Eastern Africa. I know it's a very scary thought to be responsible for all that. What would be like your personal vision to improve how we as humans interact with nature, how we can co-benefit from what nature is giving us, an idea of transformative change that might be needed also when it comes to how we use those local resources for the benefit of local communities?
Yeah, if I was king for a year, that would be well. The thing is, a year is a very short space of time to turn all of these systems around. So I think I need to be elected for much longer than that. But apart from that, no, I suppose, I'd have to walk the talk. I'd have to put in place the things that I've been talking about around co-design and co-management, and really getting from stakeholders their values, what they need, and what they want and why. But then getting all stakeholders to realize that it's not okay to degrade the system. So there are, along with rights to access and use and so on, come responsibilities of good management. So if you're going to fish, there's only so much fish that a stock population of fish can provide, in terms of offtake for fisheries. So we have to work that out, and we have to go up to that limit, but not beyond. And the same with mangrove use and land use and things like that. A key part of this is you have to have good governance. People who are either cheating the system, cheating the rules, or else harming somebody else's interests, those people have to be stopped. You have to stop those actions from happening. And I think in general, we have adequate legislation in place in East African countries, but our implementation of that legislation is terrible in terms of people being held accountable for what they're doing, and if they're harming other people's interests or degrading a resource, or stealing and things like that. So most definitely you have to have put in place good governance to enable a good system to emerge, and that good system needs to revolve around the Sustainable Development Goals, and people recognizing there are limits to what can happen. Not everybody can have exactly what they want, so we have to come to some joint agreement about what's possible and what's sustainable and what's fair. And I think there's both globally amongst countries, but also within countries, Kenya in particular, there's a huge income disparities between the top earners and the lowest, and that has to be addressed. We have to really make it so that the lowest income earners get the most increase of benefit from natural systems and from the types of economy that we have, and those who are earning a lot I think their earnings have to come down in order to because the redistribution, the fair redistribution is very important. But it's important for them to realize that in doing that, actually their quality of life will improve because there'll be fewer people who are desperate, there'll be less crime, there'll be less demands and corruption in the system and so on. And so everybody would be better off.
I think for me, I've exhausted most of my questions. So just maybe as we close, one thing that I would like to also highlight is, I mean, David, you have mentored a lot of young scientists who have worked under you for the years, and I want to believe that you're still, really passionate about mentoring young people, young scientists to take over the realm of marine research, both in Kenya, East Africa, and also within the Western Indian Ocean region. What are some of the priorities that we should invest in, particularly looking now at the interest of young scientists interested in marine conservation is waning? What are some of the things that you could perhaps speak about or use to strengthen the resolve of young scientists who might want to be involved in marine research, but then they don't see opportunities coming up? What are the available solutions in terms of setting up their own ventures, or just using their passion, being driven by their passion to really be engaged in marine, whether there are available jobs or not? What are some of the it's a motivation that you can perhaps give to young scientists to be able to take heart and not to lose their vision of marine conservation in the region?
Um, yeah, that's a difficult question. It's very difficult to understand the direction of trends in these things. I'm not sure that there's less jobs available now. I see, as you say, there have been a lot of young marine scientists who come through the system, and I think what's clear is that there aren't obvious jobs really or opportunities, but as you look around, you see many of those marine scientists working in different universities, whether in Kenya or abroad, like yourself. You find a place and you continue to contribute and engage in the issues, or else work setting up their own consultancy firms or NGOs as well. There's been quite a few of those. And I think the support for what we do is not going to go down, it's going to go up because the global economy basically increases, the global population increases. I think it's important to understand that the nature of human endeavor in society is expansionist, right? But what it's called is different. And so it may not be a classical marine science research position, but it might be more of a conservation consultancy or environmental impact assessments or environmental monitoring for companies. The question is how, in doing those jobs, can you influence what happens so to make sure that it's good, that you produce good information, that it has a positive outcome on something that's happening. And so I would say, yeah, young scientists or young, early career people should take heart that there are always more opportunities out there, and the change in the nature of those opportunities is only accelerating. So we can't really imagine what the new opportunities might be in 5 or 10 years' time. There will be different ones at that point. So be creative, be insightful, be innovative, but make sure you have a really strong knowledge foundation in some area that's important. And of course, you have to work hard, and expect make the system work well for you, so you make it accountable as well. Don't just put up with cronyism and people having favoritism and stuff like that. Work against it. Join with your peers to push the agenda, and push for change. But we certainly need many more people working in these fields, and they'll come from different directions, not just marine science too.
Thanks, David. That's quite insightful and very nice, encouraging words for everybody out there who wants to pursue a career in marine science, environmental science. Go for it, I think. Also for touching on many topics that are relevant concerning the COVID pandemic and how local communities struggle and try to deal with it. Maybe also ways to transform the system towards a better use and a fairer use of marine resources in the future. Thanks a lot for being here today. Is there any last words or any take-home messages you still want to get out there? This is your opportunity now.
Thanks, Hauke. I guess the last thing I'll say, because this did range quite widely, is that one thing I am really working on now is the Sustainable Development Goals and what we're calling, a corridor into the future. At the moment, we're going down an unsustainable path. So how do we identify what is safe and just moving into the future? And I think the more young career professionals and people working on the ground in different spaces really think through that, what is safe and what is just locally, and how do you help make that happen? I think that will help add up to an important whole, because we need change to happen at all levels to get there.
And that concludes our very first episode of the MeerWissen podcast. Thank you everybody out there for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed the show. Make sure to subscribe and tune in again next time when we will talk about fisheries data in East Africa.